Si eres un luchador, Modelo es tu recompensa y este mensaje es para ti. Toleras un poco de todo para nunca defraudar a tu gente. Eres fuerte, eres valiente, eres el campeón del barrio. Eres una máquina de chambeo, una fuerza de la naturaleza, contigo nadie se mete. Eres un real, un leal, un motor de productividad. Eres un luchador y Modelo es tu recompensa. Te has ganado hasta la última gota de esta rica lager dorada. Así que ponla en alto. Modelo, la marca de los luchadores. Todo con medida. Cerveza importada por Crown Imports, Chicago, Illinois.
Horror story of a foreigner. Since I was very young, I have traveled. My parents love visiting and getting to know new places, new people, trying new dishes, and trying to learn from the world as much as they can. The two established themselves as great researchers. My mother is a recognized sociology in the academic community, and my father also devoted many years to science in the area of international relations, and both traveled a lot around the world before they decided to have me. They seem to have taken advantage of many scholarships and programs that allowed them to travel from their time as students. Her love story is worthy of any film made by Sofia Coppola. I am told they met on a trip to Tokyo, Japan, in the same style as Lost in Translation. Both were staying in the city. They didn't know each other because they studied different disciplines, but they met in a restaurant. Apparently my mother was having trouble ordering, and my father came to help her when he noticed that she was a foreigner like him. After introducing herself, my father suggested sharing a table with her, and my mother was embarrassed, but delighted to be able to share with someone who spoke her own language. She accepted. No one is surprised by the kindness of the Japanese, but they are also very closed and lonely in public spaces. They had dinner, talked, met, and obviously fell in love. They spent the rest of their stay leaving whenever their responsibilities left them, and when they had to return to Mexico they agreed to meet in Mexico City, since my mother was from Jalisco and my father from Puebla. They were engaged together to spend time from time to time a few months, until simply the distance became more and more troublesome, and they agreed to live together in a place where they could move quickly if they needed to move to their homelands. Both got jobs in the city. They lived in Union Libre for many years and synchronized their vacations to travel to the interior of the country as well as abroad. Tokyo became a prized destination for both of them, as this is where their love story began. They visited it a few times and also took the opportunity to visit other destinations in Europe, Asia, and America. They were both very fortunate as their wages and jobs allowed them to have a fairly comfortable life. The money was rarely a problem for their plans and projects, and as is well said, when there is personal and economic stability, one thinks of a third party. In this case, having consolidated their professional careers and secured a certain wealth, they decided to have a child. I was born, and when I spent time on diet and care I was already traveling to meet my mother's family in Jalisco and my father's in Puebla. The life of my parents changed a little because while I did not have to go to school, we enjoyed a certain freedom to travel, and although it is true that as babies we remember little, there are many photographs and stories that arose during those periods that my parents remember fondly. As soon as I remember all that happened, I am very excited to see the eloquence with which both tell them. When I started with the studies, the times were limited, so it was no longer very feasible to go out for long periods. They only took advantage of the holiday periods to take me to different destinations. Yet during all that time they could never take me to Tokyo, even though they used to talk about how incredible and futuristic that city was. I could only imagine that place because of the photographs that my parents kept with great affection. At that time the internet was not as developed as it is today, with hundreds of people doing content about trips or destinations. There was information about anything they could imagine, but it wasn't that accessible. But spending much of my childhood and adolescence listening to how wonderful Japan was only awakened in me a great interest and love for a place that only existed in my imagination, as I had never set foot on that island. I became interested and even obsessed with the country to the extent that from high school I asked my parents to send me to a school to learn the language, which they did not ignore, and they signed me up for some courses I attended after going to school. I learned as much as I could about their language and customs, which generated even more expectations about the country. I never asked my parents to visit Tokyo because internally I wanted that to be something that I myself could do at some point. First I wanted to unravel most of what that place holds and then share it with my parents, as they would surely be delighted to return to those lands of which they have fond memories. But would it be the same for me? Well, that's an answer that's hardly close to what my parents got. practically all of my high school and high school years were obsessed with the country. I spent time researching different elements of the country and my conversations revolved around the same thing. I was tired of my friends talking about the same topic over and over again, although most listened carefully to what I had discovered. Other companions, on the other hand, got tired and fed up with my little obsession. By the time I was in high school, I already had more or less mastered the language, not at a very high grade because it is really a complex language and full of nuances, but, at least I think I could order the food and know which subway stations I was in because from what I understand the best way to get around the city is by train. In the end I had been preparing for a trip that might not happen, but, in spite of that, it generated a lot of excitement and enthusiasm. When I finished high school, my parents offered me a trip to Japan as a graduation gift, and I really didn't expect it. I had been fantasizing for many years about the possibility of making that longed-for trip, but on that occasion the opportunity presented itself. I did not take it. I guess because I felt I somehow didn't deserve that opportunity. My feelings told me that I had not done any merit to receive such a prize and also because I had promised to make that trip with my own resources. So, although at that time it hurt me a lot to reject the gift, my parents understood my feelings and respected it. I think they should have insisted more and I could be less proud and more humble because not all those years studying the language and part of its culture served me when I could make the happy trip. After all, the language books tell you a lot about syntax, spelling and pronunciation, but that's not enough to explain some things that come out of logic. History books can be a good starting point for learning about the country's many political, military, and economic reasons. There are studies of the Japanese character founded on honor and sacrifice. But even though he knew a lot about the country, the truth is that he knew a little bit of everything. There will always be elements that are not found in books, articles, or reports. There are very big events that due to their magnitude are not drowned in the multitude of news that flood the news every day, such as the sarin gas attacks on the Tokyo subway in the mid-1990s by the sect Aum Shinrikyo. While the attack was aimed at the government and police ended up affecting third parties, but bad memory 13 people were killed and more than 6 were injured. Shoko Asahara's distorted view led his followers to carry out different attacks that claimed different lives. Of course this incident was highly mediatized. No international or national media missed the opportunity to cover its programming with notes, investigations and analyses that began to direct the public opinion of all the viewers who had been informed in such reliable news programs. When I heard the news I froze and it was like a reality check. I mean, horrible and terrible things happen everywhere. In my country the red notes have become part of everyday life for millions. But it was strong to know that in the most magical places such situations also occur. It was something I had in mind, but that sometimes idealization leads us to ignore them in order to maintain the untainted image of a thing or person. It was shocking at the time because recently acquaintances of my parents had been violently murdered by one of their children in one of their psychotic attacks. The boy had problems and was in treatment. He led a pretty normal life. In fact, we had gone to primary school together, but apparently the boy had started to use some drugs to treat his illness by a research and testing program of a pharmaceutical. Not much was known about it and I firmly believe that everything was done to redirect the public attention of the pharmaceutical company to the boy's problems. That news had strongly affected my parents and even me, who had lived with the boy who was being tried for the murder of his own parents, blaming mainly the drugs and leaving aside the role played by the pharmacist and all the people involved in that experimental treatment. At that time I only had to focus on my studies and try to distract myself so as not to sink, so learning about the attack was news that shocked me very strongly. At home my father kept talking about the case of my ex-classmate. Some teachers also took up that case to try to show us how harmful the use of drugs came to be, and the place that had been considered as my goal of life was also turned into chaos by the attacks perpetrated on the trains by the sect of Aum Shinrikyo, who were convinced that the end of the world was approaching because of a third world war, which would be carried out with nuclear weapons that would put an end to all the sins and crimes of the world. After a few weeks the attack was no longer new and little was said about it. My parents also stopped talking about my former partner's issue when the judge sent him to prison. Everything that happened became part of the history and everyday life. We all became spectators to the immense amount of red news that abounded in print media and of all kinds. To some degree, being so saturated with malicious news began to bore the audience, because their audience also began to become numb when they gave these kinds of notes. When all this happened, I was in the last third of my degree. I had chosen to study international trade, and my research topic had focused on studying trade relations with the country of the rising sun. I had been awarded a scholarship for a semester in Tokyo because of my academic performance and because I spoke a little of the language, so I didn't think twice. I accepted the scholarship and started preparing everything for my trip. I told my parents, who were very excited about the opportunity that had presented itself to me. When the travel date came, I couldn't sleep all night. The flight left early, and the emotion and fear of traveling alone to the other side of the world kept me awake. Early in the morning, my parents got up and prepared to take me to the airport. The flight was not delayed, and the entire migration process was quite easy because I was traveling as a student. I said goodbye to both of them and arrived on the plane. I did not imagine that it would be the last time I saw them again. My arrival in Japan was incredible. Already from the airport is palpable the cultural change that you will encounter. Most of the processes are automated, so there is not much problem with the bureaucracy. At least it was not like that to enter the country. The rest of the procedures are hell. I was amazed at everything I encountered. The city was immense, the buildings huge, the streets clean, and everything very neat. But the influx of people is hell. Not for nothing is Tokyo one of the most populous cities in the world, and you can see that overpopulation. Something that initially seemed wonderful to me was the Japanese's disinterest in others. Few people will feel judged by the majority of locals in the city. They're all too busy making their lives that they barely pay attention to what's going on around them. It seems that they live alienated and isolated from the rest. I am not surprised at the high levels of depression and isolation to which the millions of Japanese who prefer to end their lives within their small apartments so that days, weeks, and even months someone will notice their absence are systematically subjected. As I got to know more deeply some of the bowels of Japan, I was a little disappointed. At least at university, I got to know people from other countries who were also on exchange with me. I shared the perspective of how difficult it is to integrate a foreigner into the logic and everyday functioning of the Japanese. They would never kick you out of a business unless you cause problems, nor would they usually treat you badly. If you had any doubts, most would try to help you or else refer you to someone qualified to do so. At university, it was relatively easier to chat with some Japanese people because we shared classes and spaces. I managed to form a small group of foreigners and some locals in the city with whom I used to go out to eat or visit some attraction. They showed me different points of the city and gave me recommendations to make my stay more pleasant, which I was very grateful for, but many people know how to hide their intentions very well. A few months after I had arrived in Japan and was trying to blend in with the Japanese, my relatives contacted me to inform me that my parents had died in a car accident while traveling to Jalisco to visit grandma, who had become seriously ill due to diabetes and hypertension. I did not expect to receive news of such magnitude while I was living the dream of visiting the city where my parents met. They offered to pay me the expenses to go to Mexico and attend the funeral, but, by talking to my coordinators and advisors, leaving this stay would make me lose the scholarship and the semester. At that time, I didn't care much. I wanted to say goodbye to my parents as best I could. Arrangements were made for him to return 8 days after his death. I couldn't get flights earlier due to various problems and threats that the sect had made against the airport, so I had to wait a week. I took advantage of that time to say goodbye to the friendships I had made with the rest of the students, and one of them, the Japanese, suggested going to a bar before he came to say goodbye to me, as it would be difficult to come back soon and the exchange of the rest was also over in a few weeks. At first I didn't feel like it, but I couldn't stay in my room crying all the time. I could hardly take a break as soon as I returned to the country and had to deal with all that a loss entails. So self-motivating, I accepted the blissful invitation. We arranged to meet in the center, and there we would head to a traditional Japanese bar. We arrived at the agreed time and went to the place recommended by our friend. The place was quite far from Tokyo. I am not sure where, because in all the time I had been there I had never visited that area. To our surprise, it was quite a nice and traditional place, just as the boy who had invited us had promised. We had a great time, although at some point it was inevitable for me to feel guilty for being there having fun while my parents' bodies were in some cold coffin. In the middle of the celebration I could not hold back the tears, and although they insisted that I had not ruined them the farewell, I knew that they were being kind to me. I shouldn't go. After drinking, singing and eating we were all quite tired. I had taken it modernly because otherwise there would be no human power that would have stopped my breakdown. I also didn't want to be a nuisance to anyone, so I was responsible for my status and consumption. Some of my friends still wanted to continue the party, but they wanted to go somewhere to dance in Tokyo. I just wanted to go home and get some rest, so I didn't accompany them. They asked for a taxi and left. I stayed with my Japanese friend and offered to take care of him until we returned to the city, as he was quite drunk. I had never seen him, so I worried a little. The barista asked for a taxi and we both took it. My friend stepped forward and boarded while I went to the bathroom. When I got back I got into the back of the car. It was late and I didn't know the area, so I had no choice but to trust the taxi driver. After a good while traveling I noticed that the illuminated city could not be seen. On the contrary, little by little we were further away, and the only thing that began to dominate in the landscape was a quite big forest. I thought the taxi driver was wrong, or that he had simply opted for another direction. My friend was asleep in the winged seat, so I tried to keep calm. Suddenly my friend woke up. He tried to locate himself and asked the taxi driver to stop. The car stopped at the side of the road and my friend opened the door and ran towards the forest. I thought maybe I wanted to throw up, but the minutes passed and my friend didn't come back. I started to worry, maybe he had fallen or had an accident. After all, it was night and there was not much lighting in that place other than the taxi lights and red rear blinkers. I asked the taxi driver to wait for us and I went into the woods trying to follow in my friend's footsteps. After walking and searching for a few minutes I noticed that there was a small cabin in the middle of the forest. A little light could be seen in the distance, so I went to that house to ask for my friend or to ask for help searching, as my bag with my belongings had stayed in the taxi. As I approached that house, I noticed that the light emitted from inside became more and more red. When I finally found myself prostrate in front of the door and irrational fear invaded me, I decided to pry through the lock of the door to see if someone was inside and try to decipher the origin of that red light. I peered through the lock and the only thing I saw was an unbearably red room, the furniture, some pictures adorning it, the walls, the floor, absolutely everything was red, when suddenly a ball began to spin and become big and small until it stared at me. It was a pupil of someone or something that was on the other side of the room peeking like I did, and we both looked to the other side through each other's eyes. When I realized that, I turned my back. I hurried back to the road where luckily the taxi was still waiting, approached him without further delay and asked him to leave. When we were leaving that place I realized that we were in Aokigahara, the forest of suicides where many people go to end their lives. The taxi driver took me to the police station where they took statements from me, gave me the anti-doping drug and asked different questions. They kept me in spite of the fact that I indicated that I was a party student and that I had to return to my country. Of course they ignored me. They sent me to a cell and days later declared me mentally unstable and with alcoholism problems. I tried to appeal the ruling, but the only thing I managed to do was get me sent to a psychiatric center, as no one could support what I was telling them about my parents, my life or my friends. In this place I'm kept high and sedated most of the time. I can neither eat nor do my needs on my own without a couple of men in a white coat holding me to clean the slime that drips on my chest because of the medication and then forcing me to swallow the liquefied foods. I take advantage to write my memories in the moments in which they allow us to do recreational activities, and I manage to hide a pencil and paper between my clothes.